Wyoming Territory, June 1881. The fire had taken her face, but not her soul, though some days Jessamine Judd did not believe even that had survived. She stood alone at the edge of the dry creek, the hem of her dress brushing the cracked earth, wind tugging her dark brown hair from its braid. The sun burned down without mercy, but she barely felt it. Her wide-brimmed hat shaded what was left of her face, the left side smooth and untouched, the right side a mess of healed-over burns that pulled her mouth into a permanent half-frown. Some days it hurt. Most days it just felt heavy, like carrying someone else's sorrow. She had been 24 when the barn caught fire. She had gone in after her horse. She had come out alive, but barely. Her father had not. It had been over a year. Long enough for the townsfolk in Casper to stop staring openly. Long enough for the whispers to start instead. No man will want her now. Such a pretty girl once. She should be thankful she's alive. But they had not seen what the flames had done to her hands, or her shoulder, or the way people looked away when they spoke to her. They had not seen how her fiancé had vanished like smoke the day after the doctor's bandages came off. She had not seen a mirror in months, not since she had moved out to the edge of the range, into the broken-down cabin her father left behind. She did not need a mirror to know what they saw. No one came by. No one except Patricia and Peter, her sister's children. Twin 6-year-olds with eyes too big and quiet for their age. They had been left on her doorstep 3 weeks ago with a note from her sister that simply read, "I cannot do this. I am sorry." Jessamine had not cried when her face melted, but she had cried then, kneeling in the dirt beside their travel-worn boots and holding them both against her chest. Now, the 3 of them survived on what she could grow, trap, and trade. The children stayed close, quiet but watchful, like little deer waiting for the next storm. She was down to half a sack of flour and no more sugar. She needed to trade for supplies, but the ride to town was long and the people there cruel in their kindness. She hated the way their eyes slid away from her. So when she heard a horse approaching, she straightened with her hand near the old rifle leaning against the porch. She expected maybe a cattle driver lost from the trail, or worse, someone looking to take what little she had. What she did not expect was a tall cowboy with a battered hat, dusty boots, and a slow-moving horse carrying a split wagon wheel in its pack. "You Jessamine Judd?" he asked, voice low, steady. She nodded once, gripping the porch rail. "Who wants to know?" "Name's Boone Vexley. I heard from the blacksmith in Casper you do repairs. Said you were the best with a wheel this side of Cheyenne." Jessamine blinked. "He said that." Boone shrugged. "Said you saved his rig 3 winters back. Figured if you could do that, you could fix mine." She looked at the wheel, then him. He was around her age, maybe a few years older, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek rock. He made no move to stare at her face, just waited. "Bring it here," she said finally. He did. The wood was cracked but mendable. She knelt beside it, letting her fingers move over the splintered edges. She felt his eyes on her hands, but he said nothing. "Give me a few hours," she muttered. "I'll wait." Most men would have found a reason to leave, but Boone stayed. He sat with the children under the shade of a cottonwood, showed Peter how to toss rocks so they skipped across the creek, tied a ribbon around Patricia's doll when she handed it to him with a shy look. Jessamine worked in silence, watching from the corner of her eye. The man had a gentleness about him that did not match his broad shoulders or the revolver at his hip. He did not flinch when Peter reached up to touch his beard or when Patricia asked if he had a wife. "No, little miss," he answered softly. "Not yet." When the wheel was fixed, the sun was low and the shadows long. Jessamine wiped her hands on her apron and stood, muscles aching. "It's done." Boone stood too, brushing dust from his knees. "How much do I owe you?" She hesitated. "I need flour. And sugar." He nodded. "Got both in my pack. Fair trade." She nodded once. He handed her the supplies, then paused. I'm headed up to the high pasture. Got a herd needing moved to greener grass. Be gone for maybe 5 days. Mind if I stop back through after? She frowned. Why would you do that? He looked at her, then not at the scars, but at her. Because I like it here. And because someone ought to check on you 3. Her throat tightened. We manage. I can see that, he said. But still. He touched the brim of his hat. See you in 5 days. He rode off with the sun behind him, casting long shadows. Jessamine watched until the dust settled, her hands clenched at her sides. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat on the porch alone, holding a cup of weak tea and staring into the dark. No one had looked at her like that since the fire. No one had seen past what was gone. Maybe he was just being kind. But maybe, just maybe, he had meant it. And that thought stayed with her long after the stars came out. On the morning of the 5th day, Jessamine woke before the children. A summer storm had moved through in the night, leaving the air damp and the porch boards slick with rain. She stepped outside with her shawl tight around her shoulders, eyes scanning the distant ridge where the land folded into itself, half expecting silence. But Boone came. His horse moved steady beneath him, its coat wet from creek crossings, a sack slung behind the saddle. He dismounted without a word, tied the reins to the porch post, and laid the sack gently at her feet. Brought coffee, he said, brushing water from his hat. And some cornmeal. Figured you might be low. She looked at the sack, then at him. I didn't ask for anything. I know. He followed her to the porch, boots leaving wet prints across the boards. He didn't sit until she did. The space between them was quiet, but not strained. The kind of quiet that had room to grow into something lasting. Boone rested his elbows on his knees, eyes on the puddled yard. You always live out this far? She shook her head. We moved here after my father passed. Before that, we were closer to town. He nodded once. I passed a place down the ridge a few miles. Looked like it burned long ago. That yours? Her mouth thinned. It was. He didn't press. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded page. Found this wedged under my saddle blanket. Looks like it fell from the sack. She took the paper, unfolded it. A child's drawing crude stick figures standing beside a horse, one of them taller, wearing a wide hat. Patricia's careful handwriting labeled each one. Mama, Peter, me. The last shape wore a long dress and stood apart from the others. Aunt Jess. Her throat tightened, but she kept her eyes dry. Boone leaned back against the porch post. She draws a lot? Jessamine folded the paper again. More lately. Helps her keep the worry off Peter. He watched the trees sway in the wind. I had a sister like that, always pretending everything was fine so I wouldn't ask questions. She's still around? He hesitated. No, they sat with that a moment. Not in grief but recognition. Peter's voice broke the silence. Boone! The boy scrambled out the cabin door in his stocking feet, holding a carved piece of wood shaped like a horse. Patricia followed, her hair still tangled from sleep. Boone opened his arms, and Peter clambered up into his lap without hesitation. You finished that carving? Boone asked, turning the piece over in his hands. Peter nodded. But it don't stand. Boone shifted it, balanced the legs on the porch rail. Now it does. Patricia sat beside Jessamine. Can Boone stay for breakfast? Jessamine glanced at Boone. He gave her a look that held no expectation, just a quiet willingness to follow her lead. She nodded. He can stay. Inside, the cabin warmed with the scent of cornmeal cakes frying. Boone took over the stove without asking, moving with the ease of a man used to feeding himself. Jessamine laid out plates, watching as he handed Peter a cake straight from the skillet, blowing on it first. "You cook like someone who's done it a while," she said. "I worked cattle drives 6 years," he replied. "You learn or go hungry." After breakfast, Boone rinsed the dishes in the basin without being told. Jessamine dried them beside him. When their hands brushed, he didn't pull back. Neither did she. He stayed through the afternoon, helping Peter mend a broken fence rail while Patricia gathered dandelion heads for dye. Jessamine worked without glancing toward them, but the sound of Boone's voice, low, steady, patient, settled something inside her she hadn't known was still restless. When the sun stretched long across the field, he stood beside his horse again. "I'll be heading north tomorrow," he said. "My cousin's got a pasture near the Bighorns. Said he needs help clearing a stretch of downed trees." Jessamine nodded, folding her arms. "How long'll you be gone?" 10 days, maybe 12. She pressed her lips together. "Safe ride, then." He paused. "You want me to come back?" Peter looked up from where he crouched in the dirt, waiting. Patricia stood still as stone. Jessamine met Boone's gaze full on. "Yes." He stepped closer, voice softer than before. "You don't have to say it just to be kind." "I'm not." He nodded once. "Then I'll come back." He mounted, turned the horse toward the trail, and tipped his hat to her. "Take care of them." "We always do," she said. But after he rode out, her hands were less steady as she folded laundry. And when she tucked the children in, Patricia whispered, "He'll come back. I think he likes it here." Jessamine smoothed the blanket over her. "I think you're right." Then she went outside and sat on the porch again, watching the sky darken over the hills. She did not cry, but she did not feel quite so alone. 12 days passed before Boone returned. The rain had come again, heavier this time, leaving deep ruts along the narrow wagon track and soaking the rows of early beans Jessamine had coaxed into growing at the edge of the clearing. Each day she checked the ridge, once in the morning and again before dusk. She told herself it was only to watch for weather, or for strays from the neighbors' cattle up the valley. But when Boone finally rode in, his coat dark with wet and his horse limping slightly, she stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping out. "You're late," she said. He swung down stiffly, leading the horse toward the lean-to. Tree gave way under the mule wagon. Took a good while to get it off the trail. "I came as soon as I could." "Your horse." "Stone bruise, I think. She'll walk it out." Patricia peeked through the window, then disappeared again. Jessamine could already hear her dragging Peter toward the door. Boone glanced toward the sound, then looked back at Jessamine. "I brought something. For you." She didn't answer, only watched as he untied a bundle from the back of the saddle. Wrapped in oilcloth, it was long and narrow, and when he handed it to her, the weight of it settled into her hands like something meant to stay. She opened it slowly. Inside was a drawknife, its blade cleaned and sharpened, the handle smooth with use. "I saw it at a trading post near Buffalo," Boone said. "Thought of the way you handled that wagon wheel. Figured you might make better use of it than the man trying to sell it for whiskey." Jessamine's fingers curled around the handle. "I've never owned one this fine." "Well, now you do." She looked up, met his eyes. "I don't have anything to trade for it." "I didn't ask for trade." Peter burst through the doorway, barefoot and breathless. "Boone, come see what we built." Boone hesitated, eyes still on Jessamine. "May I?" She stepped aside. "Go on." He followed Peter around the corner of the cabin. There, under the eaves, stood a small lean-to made from scrap wood and old canvas. Inside, 2 stools and a makeshift table fashioned from a barrel top. "It's our post," Peter said proudly, "for keeping watch." Jessamine stayed on the porch, listening to Boone admire the craftsmanship, his voice low and easy, never talking down to the boy. When they returned, She had laid out 2 mugs and poured the last of the chicory brew she'd boiled that morning. He drank without complaint. He set the mug down. "I've been thinking, Jessamine. There's a small homestead up near Goose Creek. Belongs to a friend of mine who's gone back to Tennessee to tend his mother. Said I could use the land if I wanted." She raised a brow. "You planning to run stock?" "Maybe, but not alone." He let the words settle. "There's a garden plot already tilled. Cabin's solid. Only needs patching in the roof and a new latch on the barn." She folded her arms. "And you're telling me this because it's too much land for one man, and too quiet." He looked out toward the trees. "I've been on the move a long while, Jess. I never expected to stop. But I keep finding myself thinking about this place. About you. About the way you hold things together without asking for thanks." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet pine. Jessamine gripped the mug harder. "They said no one would want me after the fire," she said, not softly, not bitterly, just the truth laid bare. "Said I should be grateful to still have my life." Boone didn't flinch. "Then they were blind." She looked at him, really looked. Mud on his coat, rain drying in his beard, hands still calloused from work. Not a man who made speeches. But he hadn't looked away once, not even now. "I see the woman you still are," he said. "Not what the fire took." Her breath caught. He stepped closer. "You don't owe me anything, Jess. But if there's a place for me here, I'd stay. If there's a place for all of us somewhere else, I'd take you and the children and build it." Peter called from inside, and Boone turned toward the door, giving her space. She didn't answer right away. She went inside, braided Patricia's hair, helped Peter find his missing sock, stirred the stew she'd started at noon. Her hands moved without thought, but her chest felt full, like something long-locked had cracked open. That night, after the children were asleep, she found Boone on the porch, blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the moon ride high above the ridgeline. She stood beside him. "Goose Creek," she said. He looked up. "How many windows does the cabin have?" He smiled, slow and real. "2 in front, 1 out back. Faces east." She nodded. "I like morning light." He didn't say anything else. Just reached out, and this time, when his fingers brushed hers, she didn't pull away. She laced her hand into his and stood there, the night stretching quiet and wide before them. There was no need for more words. Not now. The answer was already given. Boone stayed 3 more days. He patched the barn roof with salvaged shingles Jessamine had stacked behind the cabin and fitted a latch to the east window that had never closed right. The children trailed him like shadows, passing him nails and holding boards still with careful hands. Jessamine watched from the garden rows, fingers deep in soil, the sun warming her back as she worked. She didn't speak unless she had to, but her eyes found him often. On the 4th morning, he saddled his horse, tied down the last of his belongings, and waited beside the fence while she finished feeding the hens. Her apron was damp from well water, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She didn't rush. He didn't speak until she wiped her hands on a rag and stepped closer. "You sure about Goose Creek?" he asked, voice quieter than usual. "It's a rougher stretch of land. Wind comes hard off the hills." She gave a short nod. "I've lived through worse." His mouth twitched. Not laughter. Something steadier. "I'll clear the chimney and get the hearthstones sealed before I come for you. Might take me a week. Bring 2 extra saddle blankets," she said. "The children'll ride cold if the rain sets in again." She turned before he could answer, but he caught her wrist gently. "Jess." She looked at him. "You don't have to do this for me." "I'm not," she said. "I'm doing it because I want a life that doesn't feel like waiting for the next bad thing." He let go slowly. "Then I'll be ready in 7 days." She didn't watch him ride out. She went back to the garden, dug her hands into the earth, and began again. That week, she packed in the evenings after the children fell asleep. She wrapped her father's tools in burlap, folded the quilt her mother had pieced together before the war, and tucked away a worn, leather-bound book of Psalms even though she hadn't read from it since the fire. On the 6th day, she found her old riding boots behind the stove. The leather was cracked, but the soles held. She cleaned them by lamplight, set them near the door. The morning of the 7th day was clear. A thin mist clung to the trees, and the sky was pale with light not yet gold. Jessamine dressed the children in their warmest clothes, braided Patricia's hair into 2 tight plaits, and packed the last of the flour into a cloth sack. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Boone came down the trail leading a second horse, smaller and steady-footed, with an old military saddle strapped with blankets and a tin coffee pot clanging at its flank. He wore a fresh shirt, sleeves rolled to the wrist, and a hat she hadn't seen before, broad-brimmed, darker than the last. He dismounted as they stepped outside. "You're early," she said. "Didn't sleep," he answered. She handed him the sack. "There's enough food for 5 days if we stretch it." He tied it down, looked toward the children waiting near the porch rail. "You ready?" he asked them. Peter nodded solemnly. Patricia clutched her doll but didn't speak. Jessamine glanced back at the cabin. She had scrubbed the floorboards the night before, left a jar of dried beans in the root cellar for whoever came next, if anyone did. She didn't say goodbye. They rode slow. The smaller horse carried the children, Boone walking beside when the trail narrowed, guiding it with a hand on the halter. Jessamine rode behind, her back straight, her eyes on the horizon. They passed a stand of cottonwoods where the wind moved like water through the leaves and crossed a shallow stream where Peter pointed at minnows flashing beneath the surface. No one spoke much. The silence between them had changed. It no longer held pain. It simply made room. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had begun to slant long and low. It sat beneath a ridge, its roof mended, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. A mule deer moved through the clearing and vanished into the brush. Boone lifted Patricia down first, then Peter. "Go on in. It's warm." They ran for the door. Jessamine dismounted slowly, legs stiff from the ride. Boone didn't reach for her, but he waited. She stepped beside him, eyes on the cabin. "You did all this in a week?" "I worked late." They stood there, the dusk folding around them like a worn blanket. "I've been thinking," she said, voice low, "about what comes next." He looked at her then, steady as ever. "I don't want to be just surviving anymore," she said. "I want to plant things and see them grow. I want to read to the children when the snow piles high. I want to wake up and know someone will still be there when I reach across the bed." He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "So do I." She turned toward him fully. "Then stay." "I already have." She reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. Inside, the children called for them. Boone opened the door, letting the lamplight spill out into the dusk, and together they stepped over the threshold. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and bread. One bed stood in the corner, not yet made. 2 pallets for the children lay near the hearth. Jessamine stood for a moment, taking it in. Boone wrapped his arm around her waist, not tightly, just enough to remind her she wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. She leaned into him. Outside, the wind passed through the trees in long, low breaths. Inside, the fire crackled steady. And in the space between, a life was beginning. One not built from what had been lost but from what had been chosen. Jessamine woke to the hush of early snow, the kind that fell in thick silence and buried the world without a sound. The hearth had gone to embers, but the warmth of Boone beside her and the faint weight of his arm over her waist kept the cold from settling too deep. She lay still, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady and close, and let herself feel the quiet of the morning before the children stirred. Outside, the wind had calmed. The heavy snow had softened the edges of everything: the barn, the trees, the narrow fence line Boone had strung last month with Peter's help. It was their first winter together on the land, and already the routines had taken root. Jessamine rose before the sun most mornings, lit the stove, and stirred oats while Boone split kindling. Patricia fed the chickens and counted eggs aloud, her voice rising and falling like a song, while Peter kept close to Boone, trailing him through the shed or the woodshed, asking questions he never ran out of. Boone shifted behind her and murmured, "Cold." "Not yet," she whispered. His hand slid up her arm, palm warm against the wool of her nightgown. The roof held through the storm. She nodded. "I knew it would. You've done good work. I didn't do it alone." Jessamine turned toward him, the faint gray light catching in his eyes. "You don't have to keep proving anything." He touched her cheek, fingers careful. "I know. I just like building something that stays." Later, while the children played under blankets draped between chairs, Boone hiked out to check the trap line. He'd taken the sled and the old rifle, and Jessamine watched him disappear into the white, his figure swallowed by trees weighed heavy with snow. She returned to the kitchen table and laid out the scraps of calico she'd been saving. Patricia had outgrown her dress again, and Jessamine had promised her something new before the holidays came. As she stitched, her thoughts drifted to the letter that had come the week prior, her sister's handwriting faint and uneven, postmarked from a mining town west of Laramie. The words were rambling, apologetic, and distant. She had not asked about the children, not even once. Jessamine had tucked the letter away without finishing it. Boone had asked if she wanted to write back. She had only shaken her head. "Some things are better left where they are," she'd said. Boone had looked at her then, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet understanding that asked for nothing in return. By the time he returned, dusk had begun to settle. The traps had yielded 2 hares, and he'd brought back a bundle of dry pine for the stove. Jessamine took the meat and set to preparing stew while Boone laid the fire and rubbed the children's hands warm again. That night, after supper, Peter fell asleep with his head in Boone's lap, and Patricia curled beside Jessamine with her quilt tucked beneath her chin. Boone brushed the boy's hair back with a gentleness that made Jessamine's chest ache in the softest way. "You're good with them," she said, her voice low. "They make it easy." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I want to marry you, Boone Vexley." He stilled. "Jess, I've known for a while," she said. "I don't need fanfare. I just need you." Boone's hand found hers, fingers rough and warm. "You sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "This is where I want to be. With you. With them. That's all I've ever needed." He nodded once, his voice thick. "Then we'll do it proper. Come spring, we'll ask the preacher from KC to ride out." She shook her head. "I don't want to wait." Boone looked at her, searching her face. "You mean that? We've waited long enough in our lives. Let's not wait now." He let out a quiet breath, then kissed her hand, just once. "Then we'll say our vows here, by the stove, with the snow falling outside and the children beside us." They did. The next morning, Boone carved 2 plain bands from a strip of cedar. Jessamine wore hers on a leather cord around her neck until the snow melted and they could ride into town for a silver one. But she never took it off, not once, even after. They stood before the fire, hand in hand, as the wind bent through the trees and the cabin held steady around them. Patricia watched solemnly, holding the doll Boone had sewn a new dress for. Peter offered Jessamine a sprig of pine he'd tucked behind his ear. Boone said his vows with his voice low and even, his eyes never leaving hers. Jessamine said hers without trembling. They sealed them with a kiss that held no hesitation, only promise. Years passed. The cabin grew. Boone built a second room when the children grew older. Jessamine taught Patricia how to sew and let her paint the barn door with pictures of bluebirds and wheat. Peter learned to read by the firelight, tracing words aloud while Boone sharpened tools beside him. They raised goats, then a pair of milk cows. Boone traded timber for seeds, and Jessamine's garden doubled in size, feeding neighbors through 2 long winters. Folks began to stop by, not often, but enough. A traveling midwife, a young couple headed west, a tinker with a wagon full of spoons and kettles. Each one left with something from Jessamine's table and Boone's shed. No one asked about the fire. No one needed to. At each year's end, when snow covered the fields and the sky hung low with clouds, Jessamine would sit beside Boone and feel the warmth of his hand against hers and know, without question, that she had found what she had once thought gone forever. Not just peace, but love, deep and earned. And it stayed. Always.